I have a Pentax SMC M 50mm f2 lens that I'm going to be disassembling. This is kind of a pancake lens. It's pretty flat overall, and I'm not too familiar with Pentax lenses in general, but the other one that I've taken apart is a Pentax-A of the same kind, so it's a 50mm f2 as well. And although both lenses are pretty easy to take apart, the -M one here that I'm going to be taking apart, I found is actually a lot easier to repair because it uses higher quality components, there's less plastic, less adhesive, and the design is just a lot better overall. And it also just feels a lot better. This one feels plasticky when you hold it and when you're working with it, whereas this one feels like a higher quality lens. So what I'm going to be doing today is disassembling this lens to get access to the optics, diaphragm, mechanical pieces, and body sections individually so that everything can be cleaned and repaired on this lens. I'm going to start off by getting access to the diaphragm and get access to the front of the diaphragm blades and eventually remove the diaphragm so that it can be cleaned on its own. So I'm going to go in from the front of the lens to get access to the front of the diaphragm blades. Looking here at the front, you can see the name ring up here, the black ring going around here, and then the gray ring here, which is kind of in between the name ring and the optics, the front optics. The name ring itself doesn't have any slots for a spanning wrench to unscrew it, but this gray ring does. It has two slots here and here that you can use the spanning wrench on, and by undoing the gray ring, usually the name ring will kind of loosen up as well. So now I'll undo the gray ring and remove the name ring. Alright, so there's the name ring. And now what the gray ring is actually part of is the entire front optics of this lens. So by unscrewing this, the rest of the way, I'll just lift off the entire front optics of this lens and get access to the front of the diaphragm blades. So as I stop down the aperture there, you can see that I have access to the front of the blades, and I can try to clean those off. But next I'm going to get access to the back as well, and eventually remove the entire diaphragm mechanism so it can be cleaned on its own. Looking at the back of the lens, what I need to remove is this back lens group, and it's just one large piece as well. But as you can see, even with the lens focused as far in as possible, so that this section on the inside is as far back as possible, it's really flat, and it doesn't stick out of the back of the lens a whole lot. So although you can see these two slots here for the spanning wrench, unless you have a pointed spanning wrench, it's actually very hard to undo this section at this stage. So what I'm going to do instead is undo the mounting plate and then remove the back optics, and that just makes the whole process a little bit easier. So the mounting plate is held in place by these 5 screws going around here on the silver ring. So I'll loosen these up and then lift off the entire mounting plate. There's the mounting plate. And now you can see that I have a little bit better access to this back optical section here with this top ring going around here with the 2 divots for the spanning wrench. So now at this stage I can actually use the spanning wrench and just carefully undo this back optical piece as well and unscrew it. So I'll lift that off, and now I have access to both sides of the diaphragm. Next, what I want to do is be able to lift the diaphragm actually out of the lens so that it can be cleaned on its own. And to do that, I have to flip the lens back over and start looking at things on the front and removing some of these front pieces again. What I'm going to remove now is this black ring on the exterior of the lens right here, which is what the filter rings screw into and is what kind of extends in and out as you focus in and out. And it's held in place by 3 screws going around here. You can see that there are groups of 3 going around with 2 screws. You only want to undo the ones that are on top of the black ring in here. The other ones are actually going down. There's a little gap around them. So you just want to undo the ones on top of the black ring. I'll lift off this black ring. And what you can see now is the diaphragm mechanism on the inside here. So it's the kind of the circular piece right here, and this entire tube section going down here, and including the diaphragm. And it's just held in place by these other set of 3 screws going around here. And each of these screws has a little washer as well. So these are what are actually holding the diaphragm mechanism into the lens body. So I'll undo these 3 and then just lift out the entire diaphragm mechanism. And now I can just lift this entire piece right out, so I have the diaphragm on its own. It's a very simple piece. You can see I move this lever back and forth to control the diaphragm. All the actual coupling and the springs and everything is actually happening in the body section. So this piece can really easily be cleaned, and you can clean it really well because there aren't any of those mechanical components or anything else to really get in the way. Looking back at the main body section, you can see the aperture control ring. It's this ring going around here on the outside, and this just lifts right off. There is a ball bearing on the side over here, but it's fairly large compared to some of these other lenses and kind of stays in place really well. So now I can just lift off the aperture control ring. You can see the grooves where the ball bearing moves against to actually make the clicking sound. And the ball bearing itself is right here. I'm going to remove the ball bearing as well, just so I don't lose it. And now I have the body section here, this next one, which is actually what contains, it has the depth of field scale right in here. And some of it's this mechanical, it's what's actually covering up the mechanical pieces right here. So once I remove this, I'll detach the focusing part, the focusing mechanism down here from all these mechanical pieces and get access to those and be able to repair those if they had any problems. And this is just held in place by 3 screws going around on the outside right here. So I'll undo these 3 and then separate these 2 sections. This just lifts right off. And you can see that I'll set aside the focusing mechanism for a moment. The piece I just removed, I've now revealed all the mechanical parts, so the stop-down lever and the ring that it moves on. And this is actually a little bit similar to the A version of this lens, this whole setup in here, but overall much better engineered. There's a lot less that can go wrong, and again, higher quality pieces as well, which really helps. The aperture control ring is being coupled in by this little lever out here. So the aperture control ring itself moves this section back and forth, and that adjusts the curve on the aperture control. So the intersection here, this black ring is actually what is controlling the aperture directly through this little pocket over here. And then the aperture control ring is controlling the position of the inner ring by moving this kind of brass colored ring back and forth and adjusting where it falls. So as I move this, it's a little hard to do without the aperture control ring on there, back and forth, you can see that little pocket move back and forth, and that would open and close the aperture. And the entire thing is held open by default by this little wire spring over here. So overall, a pretty simple design, but it's much better and much easier to repair than the -A version. Finally, on this last focusing mechanism piece, there's 1 or 2 other things I can take apart for the body sections. I want to remove this focusing piece right here. So remove the focusing body section from the actual focusing mechanism on the inside so that you could actually clean this off. And it's just is held in place by 3 little screws down inside here, past where the diaphragm was sitting. So 1, 2, 3. So I'll undo this to remove the focusing ring. Alright, and these screws do have little washers as well. So now I have the focusing ring right here, separate from the actual focusing mechanism, which is right here with the inner section and then the outer section. So the intersection is what is actually being moved up and down. And the intersection is coupled to the outer section by these 2 bars right here. But those aren't really necessary to remove unless you're actually having problems with focusing and it's a little bit gritty, in which case you can undo these 2 sections and then try to find what's causing that problem. So at this stage, I've kind of taken everything as far apart as you will need to in most cases. Have the body sections, such as the focusing ring, the aperture control ring, and things like the filter ring here, all separate from the lens, so they can be cleaned individually without worrying about damaging the optics or the mechanical components. Have the focusing mechanism here, and then the mechanical parts themselves in this piece right here, so if there are any mechanical problems you can repair those. And then the optics, of course, on their own as well. And these two, let me zoom back in, the optics can be further disassembled. You can see that on this front lens piece especially, there is a second set of slots for a spanning wrench on this gray ring right here. And to disassemble this further, if there was actually some debris or dust or something inside the lens here, and it's not just on one of the surfaces, what you would want to do is use some sort of light solvent or some sort of thing to dissolve. There's a little bit of adhesive or something around here. Dissolve that and then unscrew this first outer ring here, and then you would be able to remove the front glass element and clean inside of there as well. And you can do much of the same thing on the back optics as well. So now I'm going to start the reassembly. And it's also a fairly easy process. Most things just fit together correctly. There aren't too many difficulties in the reassembly. So I'll start with the focusing mechanism here, and then the focusing ring as well, and attaching these two pieces together again. So I'm going to kind of find a rough orientation. I made a few marks on here to record where I took this apart, and just get this in the rough position where it's going to go. Once I detach these two sections, you really have to take the lens outside and zero it back to infinity. But for now, I just want to get it in a general position of where it should go. So I'll use the 3 little screws with the washers and attach these two sections together again. Next, I'll put the mechanical part here, the body section with all the mechanical pieces on the inside, back in place as well. And the orientation for this needs to go, let me line this up here. It needs to go so that the 3 screw holes going around here line up with the 3 on the inside section here. And the way you can tell, because you could kind of reattach it in one of 2 positions, the way you can tell which one to reattach it in is that when attaching the focusing ring here, you should be able to generally tell if you're closer to focusing at infinity, and that would be that the intersection here is as far in as possible, or at the minimum focusing distance, where the intersection here is as far out as possible. So in this case, I'm pretty much right at infinity, where this intersection is very far in. So I want to reattach it in the orientation where the little arrow, which is indicating the current focus, is closer to the infinity. Now I'll reattach these 2 sections using the 3 little screws going around the edge here. And now I have to get the aperture control ring back in place. And for this to properly work, there are 2 things that have to get lined up. On the aperture control ring, the way it's getting coupled in is this little post over here that's sticking out through the lens body, and it actually moves the mechanical parts back and forth, and as I showed before, it moves that ring back and forth, which then controls the diaphragm. So this little post on the outside here is what's doing the coupling, and that has to get lined up. So on the aperture control ring itself, there's a little section right here, kind of near the grooves, and that's actually what is doing what this little post goes into, so that the 2 are coupled together. And the other thing that has to happen is the ball bearing has to go in this little slot right here under the indicator, so the focusing indicator, and it has to go on the grooves here so that when you move the aperture control ring back and forth, it clicks. So getting those 2 lined up, I'll mainly focus on getting the aperture control ring coupler over here lined up properly, and I should be able to easily slide it over the ball bearing as well once that's lined up. Okay, and I can check. I should see that when I move the aperture control ring back and forth, this post over here is also moving back and forth, and that it's also clicking. Now I'll put the diaphragm back in place, and flipping over the lens here, as I showed before, the diaphragm is being controlled, the aperture is being controlled by this little post here on the diaphragm mechanism, which then couples into this little pocket on the lens. So to line these up, I'll just look in from the back of the lens and line up that post so it goes into that little pocket and slide these together. Let me grab a lens cap to set this on. And even with this coupled in, you can see that by just moving around the diaphragm mechanism on the inside here, it's actually, I can control the aperture. And one of the interesting things about this is that there's no correct way to, there's no locked position to reattach this and lock this down. So you really have to find and make your best effort to find the orientation by spinning this around where the diaphragm is, or the aperture is being set correctly. So right now I have the lens set to f2, so it should be fully open, and by spinning this around I can make sure that the lens is fully open in this orientation. And then I want to reattach this by using the screws that are counterclockwise of each other in the pairs, so the counterclockwise ones. So I'll just pick one screw here with a little washer and try locking this down. And now moving the aperture control ring on the back, I should see that it clicks at all the different aperture settings and is fully open at the maximum aperture as well. And it's not completely closed at the minimum aperture. So those are kind of the things you want to look for. So I'll finish up this section by putting the other two screws in place, again counterclockwise of in the pairs. Next, I'll reinstall the front optical group here. It just screws into place into the diaphragm mechanism. And I'll lock it down using the spanning wrench. And I'm going to flip the lens over now to get in the back optical piece as well, leaving this front section exposed so that we can focus it back to infinity later. So now I'll go back to the back section and reinstall the back optical piece as well. So it just screws in place as well and then locks down with the spanning wrench. And to complete the back reassembly, I'll reinstall the mounting plate. On the mounting plate, there are two holes on it. So there's this one over here that's kind of skinny and narrower, and then there's this longer one. And the longer one over here is what the aperture control is going through, so it's signaling to the camera where the aperture is set over here. And then this other one, the skinnier one, is where the stop down lever is going through. So if I line those up properly, there should be a set of screw holes that are lined up below there. So I'll reattach these two sections with the 5 screws going around on the mounting plate. And the reason that I've been switching back and forth between the front and the back of this lens is so that I can show how you'd properly focus the lens back to infinity. What I have at the moment is the entire lens assembled except for just the filter ring here and the name ring. So all the optics and everything important is in place, including the focusing mechanism, so I can and the mounting plate, so I can actually mount this on the camera, and I have access to the focusing mechanism, what's actually coupling the focusing ring here to the focusing mechanism. So these 3 little black screws. So to zero this lens back to infinity, mount this on the camera and focus this around, undoing these screws if I need to just move the intersection here independently of the focusing ring and get it so that it's optically focused at infinity. And once I find that, I would loosen up these little 3 screws on the inside here and then spin the focusing ring around independently of the focusing mechanism so that it reads infinity over here on the lens body, and then tighten those little 3 screws back down so that it is optically focused at infinity when the visual indicator says that it's at infinity as well. Continuing on with the reassembly though, I'll put the filter ring holder back in place. It just sits on top of this diaphragm mechanism, and it has the gaps for the 3 screws that we already installed in the pairs, and then the other set should line up with the screw holes that were left. So I'll reattach these 2 pieces with the 3 screws. And finally, I'll reinstall the name ring here just by screwing it into place in the filter ring. This is a very repairable lens overall. You can get access to the diaphragm in 3 or 4 steps and actually remove the entire diaphragm mechanism pretty easily. And you can actually disassemble the entire lens without too much difficulty to clean all the individual body sections. Its mechanical design also, it's so simple that you can really easily diagnose and repair any problems that you have with the something like the aperture control or the focusing. Compared to the -A version of this lens, the -M version, which we just took apart, it's far simpler. It doesn't use any of the adhesive, and the internal construction is just a whole lot more robust, where it's using higher quality parts in the actual design of how everything's locking together. It's a whole lot easier to put together correctly, whereas the -A version, I had to spend a whole lot of time just fiddling around with all the individual pieces to try to make sure they lined up. So this is definitely a very repairable lens that you can easily take apart and service yourself.